in here, I describe an incident that happened about a year after I was fired. The two top officers in the United Church, right on the verge of these lawsuits beginning, the first lawsuit that I mentioned, Virginia Coleman and Marion Best, two top officials in the United Church, met with all of the top leaders of what's called the Neo-colonial Tribal Council. And I know this from my friend Bruce Gunn, who was a minister. He was one the United Church minister, the only one who stood by me. And then he got the hammer as well for doing so, but he lost his job and marriage, same pattern, right? But he said that he was in on this meeting, and they made an offer to the chiefs, the United Church, and they said, we will provide limited compensation for personal injury lawsuits, not of a criminal nature, because there's civil law and criminal law. And the term abuse refers to what's called a tort offense. So if somebody takes a rock and throws it through your window, you can have a settlement, you can have compensation in that. And that's how the residential school mass murder was defined, as a civil action that can be compensated for, not as a criminal act where people are being killed. And so they made the deal that night. They said, we will give you money for personal injury lawsuits, provided you do two things: have nothing to do with Kevin Annett and never acknowledge his existence, and never support any inquiry into the death or disappearance of children. And they agreed. All the NTC chiefs agreed. And since then, every single chief who had any money from the government pulled back. They not only wouldn't support what we were doing, but they actively campaigned against it. When we held our first tribunal, we invited a United Nations group called IRAM into Vancouver, June 12th to 14th, 1998. They heard 3 days of testimonies from eyewitnesses we had lined up. These are all Native people. I was one of the few white people there. We had about 100 people in the Maritime Labor Center in east side of Vancouver. They described things like sterilization programs, medical experiments at Indian hospitals, killings. One woman describes soldiers taking kids out of the hospital one day, lining them up against, just shooting them and throwing them in a ditch in 1944. So these kinds of killings going on, being described for the first time publicly. And none of that made the media, of course. But out of the IRAM tribunal, within 6 months, the government had set up what's called the Aboriginal Healing Fund, right? The first of their cover-up attempts. What the Healing Fund said, it said, if you're a survivor of residential school, you can get money, provided you do two things. You sign off all legal action, and so you can never sue it, and you indemnify the churches. So in other words, what you're saying is, in return for the money is, you didn't do anything wrong. In return for this blood money, they would do that, right? A lot of Native people wouldn't do it. Some did. But the ones who did are the ones you heard about, because they were, it's like the natives you see on television, the government-funded chiefs. There was a line drawn in the sand, and the only people who supported me after that were the people living on the street, the people on reserve. Some of the clan mothers, like especially out here where the clan mother system is more intact, like among the Mohawks, the Grand River Mohawks, who invited me in 2011 to come and dig at the mass grave there. Those are the people who we worked with, but it's like you get that division, really it's a class division on every reserve, where there's the poor traditional people and then the well-funded government-affiliated chiefs. And they know, you see, not only are they doing it for money, but when you were in residential school, there were, and a lot of survivors describe this, Harriet said on the first day she was at the Alberni Residential School, they're lined up, 300 of them, all had their heads shaved. They're standing in the rain, they came by, head shaved. And there were some Native kids with short hair standing on the side holding little clubs. Like something out of Auschwitz, you know, the Sonderkommando, the Jewish trustees who would line up and beat other Jews into cattle cars and that. Same system, the collaborators. And Harriet turned and talked to her cousin in her language, and one of these Native kids came over and whacked her and said, you can't speak your language. Now, a lot of those kids, they were in what's called the protected group. So they got education, they weren't raped as often, they got better food. They knew how to collaborate. And guess who gets the education? Guess who goes on to become tribal council chief, and who is now dealing the drugs on the reserve and trafficking the children. And the RCMP look the other way because they're playing the government's game. They sign away the land You know, they're working for against their own people constantly. And it started early on. It's any system of neo-colonialism. The British did it in India. They bring leaders over and train them in Oxford and Cambridge, go back and monitor the empire for them. I mean, it's how empire works. So why would Canada be any different? What's different about Canada is it's so effectively hidden because the country is so vast.